college years, my dad and I would come down here to the Chesapeake Bay from where we lived in Pittsburgh and charter sailboats in the summertime. So we'd sail out of Annapolis and Oxford and other places. And eventually, my dad retired and bought a boat that happened to be up in Lake Ontario. So we sailed it down the Erie Canal and down the Hudson River and up the Delaware Bay and down the Chesapeake Bay, and got here in October or Halloween of 1981, and looked around and just decided, hey, why bother going anywhere else? The beauty of Annapolis is that essentially it hasn't changed at all in 350 years. The skyline is still the same. You notice that there are no skyscrapers in Annapolis. That's because Baltimore was born about the time of the Revolutionary War, and all of the business went there instead of here. So it really is a big, small town, and it always keeps you on your best behavior. Well, the Western Rhode Riverkeeper, which is where I served, was started in 2007 by my mentor, named Bob Gallagher, who's a local attorney, and he lived in Shadyside at the time. And the Riverkeeper organization is now a worldwide organization, but it's made up of independent nonprofit groups like the one Bob started. And each Riverkeeper is assigned one or two individual waterways. Its one and only job is to spend all of his day and nights worrying about that one or two rivers. So the idea is to combine monitoring, patrolling, keeping an eye on things, reporting infractions on construction equipment doing the wrong thing or tearing up trees or whatever it is. We don't have any authority, but we know who to yell at. The unique perspective I come from in what I bring to this job from a unique perspective, what I'm trying to say is my time with the Annapolis Maritime Museum. I worked there from its very raw beginnings in the year 2000 up until 2011, 2012. Rebuilt an old oyster packing plant in Eastport called the McNasby Oyster Company building from its devastation by Hurricane Isabel in 2003, and created exhibits and all about oysters and the oyster industry, and got to know the watermen and the people who worked in places like McNasby's, and got to learn that culture and history and heritage. And that's what I brought to the Riverkeeper. Knowing how we got here helps you understand what we have to do in order to get where we need to be. Well, there was a direct contrast, particularly in the Rhode River. And this is tiny in comparison to most of the other estuaries feeding into the main stem of the Chesapeake Bay. But it's unique in that along it, the northern shore was very densely populated. That was the Mayo Peninsula. And so it's fairly densely populated. It's part of Edgewater, just south of Annapolis proper. But that one shore was the only area that was heavily occupied by house structures. The other several miles of shoreline were open mainly due to the fact that the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center occupies most of that area. 2,552 acres and about 15 miles of shoreline. And that allowed for a little bit of relief. It's a little less polluted than the other rivers in Anne Arundel County, particularly as the further north you get, further toward Baltimore. But it still had its issues. So, for instance, one of the problems that the Rhode River is still facing is the lack of submerged aquatic vegetation. or SAV, or seaweed, bay grasses. And this is of course, it's critical that we have good coverage of bay grasses. It's habitat for immature fish and crabs, and adds to the oxygenation of the water, filters the water. But the problem is that there is enough nutrient and sediment pollution to make the water so dense that sunlight can't penetrate to the bottom to allow the photosynthesis, to allow the plants to grow. What the nutrients do allow to grow are the algae. And the algae are anywhere from a single cell free-floating plant to that stringy, gloopy, greeny stuff you see sometimes growing on top of ponds, for instance. The excess nutrients from farms and from fertilizers on lawns and from other septic tanks that aren't working properly. That nitrogen and the phosphorus gets into the waterways every time it rains, causes the algae to bloom. When that algae dies, it sinks to the bottom and decays, and as it decays, it sucks up all the oxygen, creating dead zones, which can cause fish kills and all kinds of terrible there. The other long-term threat in global warming is sea level rise, and a lot of southern Anne Arundel County is 3 feet above water, and in 50 years, it's going to be underwater. And so that's a real issue that needs to be addressed. We really need to concentrate on forcing the Environmental Protection Agency and the Chesapeake Bay program to do its job in monitoring the progress of particularly Pennsylvania and New York to do what they need to do, what they promised to do as part of the Chesapeake Bay program and the Chesapeake Bay Clean Water Blueprint. But then worldwide, just dropping out of the world effort to reduce climate change and the air temperature around the globe is just not just poor leadership, it's just leading us to our doom, literally. So we need to change leadership in Washington, and we need to do it fast. What I'm hoping is that we'll come out of this with a whole new perspective. I think we'll come out of this on the other side of the election with a new perspective and new leadership in Washington. I think through the Black Lives Matter protests, that we'll have a keener appreciation that old white guys like us can say we appreciate. We don't totally never understand what's going on, but at least we have a keener appreciation of what we need to do in order to make a difference. And I think if we all take the time that we have been given us to do that sort of reflection, that when we come out of this, we'll come out of it stronger and smarter and more united, despite the fact that we've been isolating ourselves.